Welcome back to Architecture Topics. I'm Liam Karen, and today we are going to travel to Northern Europe, to a city that stands on the edge between wilderness and civilization, where you can stand on a busy street and see untouched nature in the distance. Today we are going to Norway to talk about the Oslo Opera House. By the way, this building was suggested by one of our listeners, Imre Romstad. So thank you, Imre, for this great suggestion. And if anyone else has a building you would like us to cover, don't hesitate to let us know in the comments. I personally read all of them. Cool. Now let's jump right into it. By the late 1990s, Oslo was a capital with a quiet confidence. Norway's oil wealth had transformed the country's economy, but not its understated character. Even as the state coffers grew richer, Norwegians carried an ingrained skepticism toward grand displays. That was partly why, for nearly a century, the city had lived without one of the cornerstones of cultural life, something every other world capital had: a dedicated opera house. And it wasn't because they hadn't tried. The idea had first been floated as far back as 1917, but world wars, economic uncertainty, and political hesitation kept pushing the idea back. Opera and ballet continued to share space in a modest building on Stortingsgata Street, a building that by then had seen better days and could no longer carry the weight of the nation's cultural ambitions. Some thought it was charming, but others saw a glaring gap in the country's cultural infrastructure. But by the turn of the millennium, the national mood had shifted. Norway had the means to dream a little bigger, and politicians saw an opportunity, not just to house the Norwegian National Opera and Ballet, but to create a landmark that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great cultural buildings of Europe. Finally, in 1999, after decades of hesitation, the parliament gave its approval for the new Opera House project to move forward. It would rise on Bjørvika, a stretch of waterfront east of the city center that was still little more than industrial land and quiet docks. The choice of location was deliberate. This wouldn't be a cultural monument tucked away behind heavy doors. It would sit right at the edge of the Oslo fjord, where the city could walk down to the water and meet it face to face. The government announced an international design competition that drew an overwhelming response. 350 proposals from architects around the world. Each offered their own vision of what a Norwegian opera house could be in the 21st century. But one entry in particular stood apart. It came from a homegrown practice, Snøhetta, already known for projects that blurred the line between architecture and landscape. Their concept didn't look like a traditional opera house at all. There was no imposing facade, no staircase meant to be climbed only by ticket holders. Instead, they imagined a vast, sloping roof of white stone that anyone could walk on. A surface that would rise gently from the fjord, like a shard of glacier breaking through the water. The design was built on three metaphors: the wave wall, the factory, and the carpet. The wave wall would form the undulating wooden interior of the main auditorium, a sculpted surface recalling both a ship's hull and the movement of water. The factory would be the working heart of the building, a reminder that opera and ballet are crafts as much as performances. And the carpet, the great sloping roof, would be the city's living room, a public plaza in stone. In a country where public space is valued as a shared right, the idea of making the roof as open and walkable as a city park was more than a design choice. It was a cultural statement, one that Snøhetta likely knew other practices, less familiar with Nordic culture, might overlook. When Snøhetta's design was revealed in the year 2000, the public reaction in Norway was mixed, but mostly leaning toward curiosity and excitement rather than outrage. On one hand, there was a sense of pride that a Norwegian firm had won over hundreds of international competitors. Many people liked that the design felt accessible and democratic, a rejection of the elitism often associated with the opera. But there was also skepticism. Some critics called it a giant white ramp to nowhere, and worried it would be more of a public promenade than a serious cultural building. Others questioned the practicality. Would the marble be too slippery in winter? Would tourists treat it like a ski slope? And of course, there were concerns about the budget, with the fear that it could spiral into one of those infamous public works projects that overshoot their costs and timelines. Still, compared to many high-profile cultural projects in Europe, the backlash was relatively mild. Construction began in 2003, although for months there was little to see above ground. First, the team had to figure out the foundations, which are never easy when building right on the edge between the water and the ground. The site had been an industrial fill for decades, and beneath the surface was a mix of old harbor sediments, timber piles, and unpredictable pockets of soft clay. The team ended up driving hundreds of steel piles deep into the ground, some reaching as far as 60 meters, to support the weight of the iconic marble-clad roof. A roof that, all on its own, would become one of the project's defining challenges. Snøhetta had chosen white Carrara marble for its brightness and timelessness, but Norway's winters are long and wet, and marble can be treacherous when icy. To solve this, each slab had to be cut with a subtle texture, providing grip without losing its smooth, glacial feel. But just as the sloping roof began to take shape, workers discovered that fitting the marble perfectly across such irregular planes was like tiling a hillside. Every joint had to be planned and adjusted with millimetric precision. Because from the outside, the roof looks like one perfect, continuous surface. But the marble is just a permeable finishing layer. Under it, the real roof is made of a patchwork of different planes, each slightly angled from the next, to guide rainwater and melting snow towards the draining points. That's what the workers meant when they said that it was like tiling a hillside. In total, more than 36,000 marble panels were installed, each cut and positioned so that the joints would form a unique composition that is, in itself, a work of art. Inside, the wave wall began to rise, crafted from strips of oak layered and bent into sweeping curves. Shaping it was almost like building a ship. Each piece of timber was steamed and fixed in place to form a continuous skin that both embraced the audience and tuned the acoustics of the main hall. And the vast glass facade also presented its own set of challenges. Angled columns of steel had to be placed to resist the shifting pressures of wind and temperature without blocking the panoramic views toward the fjord. The glass panels were treated to reduce glare so that the building's interior would remain visible from the outside without turning into a giant mirror under the low Nordic sun. By the time the roof was complete, it had already become a destination for locals. Even before the interior was finished, Oslo residents could be seen climbing its slopes to watch the harbor or simply sit and feel the wind off the water. The Opera House was becoming part of the city long before the first curtain would ever rise. The Oslo Opera House officially opened on April 12, 2008, 6 months ahead of schedule and around $29 million under budget. In the world of large cultural projects, that alone was almost unheard of. The opening was a national event. The King and Queen of Norway attended, along with dignitaries from across the Nordic countries. Outside, crowds gathered along the fjord, some even choosing to watch the ceremony from the roof itself, as if to prove that this was, indeed, their building. Inside, the audience experienced the Opera House for the first time as it had been imagined, stepping from the crisp light of the glass foyer into the warm embrace of the oak wave wall, then into the deep, velvety darkness of the main hall. For many, it was the most beautiful performance space they had ever seen in Norway. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Critics praised its openness, its generosity as public space, and its ability to become a landmark without dominating the city. It wasn't just a building for opera lovers, but a place for everyone, a spot to eat lunch, to meet friends, to watch the sunset over the harbor. In its first year alone, more than 1.3 million people visited, far exceeding expectations. Some came for performances, but most simply wanted to walk the roof or explore the interiors. And internationally, the project became a calling card for Norway's cultural ambition. Awards followed quickly, including the 2009 European Prize for Contemporary Architecture, which placed the Oslo Opera House among the most important buildings of its time. But perhaps the greatest achievement was that the building felt lived in from day one. An opera house that belonged as much to the skaters, tourists, and office workers on its roof as to the singers and musicians on its stage. Today, it's hard to imagine Oslo without the opera house. Office workers climb the white slope every day on their lunch breaks, and tourists visit it camera in hand. Concerts and opera performances continue inside. But the building's real success lies in how it has blurred the boundary between cultural monument and public space. The transformation of the Bjørvika neighborhood owes much to this building. Around it, new museums, offices, and apartment blocks have risen, and the waterfront has become one of the most visited places in Oslo. And the Opera House didn't just mark the start of that change. It set the tone for it. Architecturally, it became a case study in how a major cultural building can invite people in rather than intimidate them. And the fact that it opened ahead of schedule and under budget only strengthened its reputation as a model for public projects. For Snøhetta, it cemented their place on the global stage, proving that their blend of sculptural form, material honesty, and cultural sensitivity could resonate far beyond Norway. The Oslo Opera House is many things: a stage, a landmark, an icon, but above all, it is an extension of every home along the fjord, an indispensable part of the community, a neighbor whose door is always open. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow, like, and share. It really, really helps the show. I'm Liam Karen, and I'll see you soon with more stories like this one. Until then, keep looking up.